July 1944. U.S. General George Patton's tanks lead the vital breakout from the D-Day beaches of Normandy and head for the German flank. February 1991. American tanks race across the desert to outflank Saddam Hussein's much-vaunted Republican Guard and liberate Kuwait. Flank attack, going around the side of the enemy instead of taking him head-on, is one of the most basic of military maneuvers. Key victories, decided by a flanking maneuver, fill military textbooks. And the ultimate goal, which only a few generals ever achieve, is encirclement, sealing off and destroying the enemy. The battle plan is flank attack. Mid-July 1944, 6 weeks after the Allies successfully landed on D-Day, but they have not broken out. Progress is slower than intended. There is a danger that all momentum will be lost. The Allies need a new plan. What can Allied Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and Ground Forces Commander British General Bernard Montgomery do? Their decision could mean the difference between victory and defeat against Nazi Germany. August 1990. Iraq's Saddam Hussein has invaded Kuwait. An international coalition is formed against him. According to intelligence reports, Saddam's army is massive, well-equipped, and dug into strong defensive positions inside the Kuwaiti border. U.S. General Norman Schwarzkopf is in charge of the military campaign against Saddam. He believes he does not have sufficient forces to attack head-on. What can Schwarzkopf do? The answer for Eisenhower in 1944 and Schwarzkopf in 1990 is the same. Don't hit the enemy head-on. Hit his side. Hit him where he might be weak.
If you come at them from the front and the line is 600 men long, all 600 can shoot at you. But if you come at them from the flank and they're only 3 deep, then only those 3 can shoot at you. So you can literally roll down their flank and crush them 3 at a time.
Sometimes a flank already exists. Sometimes it has to be created. In Operation Desert Storm in 1990, Saddam's forces are concentrated along or close to the Kuwaiti border. So a flank is already there, to the west. Schwarzkopf has the option of making an oblique attack or thrusting deep to achieve an encirclement. In contrast, in Normandy in 1944, the German defensive line is unbroken. The Allies are hemmed in. They must tear open a hole to create the conditions for a flank attack. But to succeed, both Eisenhower in 1944 and Schwarzkopf in 1990 need to meet the same requirements in the flank attack battle plan. Objective: commanders must know how the flank attack fits into their overall battle plan and what they want to achieve with it. Force buildup. Commanders must prepare sufficient forces, both to achieve the flank attack and then to exploit it. Concealment. Commanders must disguise both their plan and the forces they are gathering to execute it. Execution. The plan must be executed swiftly and mercilessly. Endgame. In the heat of battle, commanders must know precisely where their battle plan ends and what they want to have achieved at that point. France, 1944. And Iraq, 1990. It's time for the generals to address the first requirement in the battle plan for flank attack. Objective. Commanders must always focus on the specific goal of the flank attack within their overall battle plan. In Normandy in July 1944, Eisenhower's objective is clear. D-Day has gone well. The next stage of the plan is for the Allies to break out from the beachhead. This will be achieved in 2 stages. The British and Canadians will break out in the east, around Caen. Then the Americans will break out from the west. But the plan goes wrong. In the east, at the end of June, British General Montgomery tries to bypass Caen, but is stopped. In the west, the Americans make their attempt on July 3rd, but they are slowed up by the bocage, a lethal maze of thick hedges, small fields, and sunken lanes.
The problem the Allies had was how to work out how they could break through the German defensive grid built up on the bocage network of hedges in Normandy. The Allies had a superior number of tanks. They hadn't worked out the tactics to use them effectively in France.
After 18 days, U.S. casualties total more than 40,000, while gaining only a few miles. The vital breakout has not been achieved. But the Allied generals have prepared a contingency plan for this situation. In Operation Goodwood, Montgomery will continue to attack in the east to draw in German reinforcements. This should create a weak point in the German defensive line to the west. So Operation Cobra, the U.S. assault, can tear a hole in it. But Monty and Eisenhower now have a much more ambitious objective than just breaking out. They see an opportunity to outflank, encircle, and destroy Hitler's armies in France. In the Gulf in 1990, Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf has been given a clear objective: drive the Iraqi forces out and liberate Kuwait. At first, Schwarzkopf intends a straightforward assault from Saudi Arabia into Kuwait to push the Iraqis out. But his superiors suggest he reconsider, pointing out the open flank to the west that might be exploited. Schwarzkopf's intelligence also reports that Saddam has a massive, well-equipped army dug in to strong defensive positions inside and all along the Kuwaiti border. A head-on attack could result in the sort of bloody battle Schwarzkopf wants no part of.
American strategy for the Gulf War was rather straitjacketed by Vietnam syndrome, the fear of massive casualties. Schwarzkopf well knew that he was facing the 4th largest army in the world.
Coalition spokesmen encouraged journalists, and they hope the Iraqis, to believe the main thrust of Schwarzkopf's attack will be across this heavily fortified southern border of Kuwait. Rumors are spread that Schwarzkopf's rules of engagement limit him to fighting only in Kuwait and not in Iraq itself.
The coalition made the Iraqis think that an Allied push would only be into Kuwait itself, using particularly the Arab coalition forces.
But Schwarzkopf now has other ideas. His new flank attack battle plan becomes one of the great sports metaphors in the military textbooks, his famous Hail Mary pass into Iraq. In the Gulf in 1991, the Iraqis expect the coalition to mount a frontal assault across Kuwait's southern border. But at a top-secret meeting, Schwarzkopf takes his commanders by surprise. The main thrust will be against Saddam's unguarded western flank, 150 miles inland, deep inside Iraq. If he can pull it off, it will be a classic flank attack and fulfill his main objective, liberating Kuwait. But his tactics now suggest a second, much bolder objective. While pinning the Iraqi forces in Kuwait with a frontal assault across the Saudi border, his flank attack will prevent reinforcement, seal off their escape route, encircle them, and destroy Saddam's army once and for all. But these two objectives might present him with a problem.
From the start, it's clear that General Schwarzkopf has a number of contradictory objectives. On the one hand, he's been asked to liberate Kuwait City and drive the Iraqi forces out of Kuwaiti territory. On the other hand, he's been asked to trap the Republican Guard.
If his frontal assault is too successful, driving Saddam's forces out of Kuwait too quickly, his flank attack might not have time to seal off the Iraqi escape. France in 1944, and the Gulf in 1991. The generals must move to the next stage in the battle plan for flank attack. And for Schwarzkopf in particular, this presents major problems. Fail to address these, and he risks losing the war. Force buildup. Commanders must prepare sufficient forces both to achieve the flanking maneuver and then exploit it. Normandy, July 1944. Although the Allies have landed almost 1 million men, they still do not have the clear numerical superiority in combat troops and tanks to ensure a breakthrough. By attacking around Caen on the 17th, Monty hopes to draw German forces, particularly their armor, in his direction and away from the US forces in the west. This should give the Americans the force ratio advantage needed to punch through the German line a week later. The plan works. By late July, the Germans have thrown 14 divisions, including 6 panzer divisions, against the British and Canadians. The US attack will face understrength infantry units, backed by just 2 panzer divisions. Their breakout attempt should enjoy a considerable force ratio superiority. The Allies also have one other crucial force ratio advantage. They control the skies. Operation Cobra, the American breakout, will begin with a massive air assault to create a hole west of Saint-Lô and allow US forces to thrust south. When they reach Avranches, they will have outflanked the German line. US armor will then swing east to Le Mans and then north toward Falaise to encircle them. In the Gulf, despite America's superpower status, General Schwarzkopf believes he faces a massive force ratio problem. In October 1990, President Bush raises the number of troops at Schwarzkopf's disposal to 400,000. But Pentagon intelligence is telling Schwarzkopf that the Iraqis are building up to a deployment of 545,000 troops, plus 4,300 tanks, 2,700 armored personnel carriers, and 3,000 artillery pieces. Classic military doctrine suggests a 3-to-1 ratio of attacker against defender is necessary, 5-to-1 against a defender in well-entrenched positions. The numbers don't lie. Schwarzkopf is outnumbered at the start of Desert Storm by 2-to-3 in tanks and 1-to-2 in combat soldiers. Saddam also has a significant advantage in artillery. But Schwarzkopf has an air armada of 2,800 aircraft, making the air war crucial. Plus, he has almost total sea control. But he cannot win without a land battle. And Schwarzkopf's nightmare scenario, especially after the U.S. experience in Vietnam, is that his men will get bogged down in a grinding attritional battle. Somehow, Schwarzkopf must swing the force ratio balance in his favor. He starts by positioning his ground and sea forces as if the main assault will be the frontal attack across the southern border of Kuwait. The U.S. Marines and Arab coalition units will mount this head-on assault. The main flank attack force, the tanks of U.S. 7th Corps and the British 1st Armored Division are to their left, with 18th Airborne Corps apparently in reserve. This much he'll let Saddam see. Then, Schwarzkopf will launch his air campaign. In addition to other objectives, this will effectively render Saddam blind, wiping out his ability to see from the air what Schwarzkopf plans next. Then, under the cloak of air cover, he will move 7th Corps 150 miles west. He will also move 18th Airborne Corps to the west of 7th Corps. Then he will launch his ground attack. First, a diversionary frontal assault and a feint amphibious attack against Iraqi forces on the Kuwaiti border. Meanwhile, 18th Airborne will sweep around Saddam's flank in the far west and cut Iraqi supply lines. Then the tanks of 7th Corps and the British will penetrate Iraqi defenses west of the Kuwaiti border and trap Iraqi forces in Kuwait in a giant pincer movement. But in planning this, Schwarzkopf faces two problems. First, the logistical nightmare of moving 7th Corps. 43,000 wheeled and 7,000 tracked vehicles, and 150,000 troops 150 miles inland. And 18th Airborne Corps a further 100 miles west. All this must be done in secret, and it must be accomplished in 11 days. The second problem could prove catastrophic. The Arabs say the western desert is impassable. Schwarzkopf doesn't know whether the shifting sands in Iraq can take the weight of his tanks.
It was an unknown territory, the other side of the Saudi Arabian-Iraqi borderline. And for the coalition, it was crucial. They needed to know whether it was terrain that would support larger numbers of tracked and wheeled vehicles.
Schwarzkopf faces an agonizing decision. If his flank attack gets bogged down, his entire plan collapses, and Saddam wins. The entire coalition battle plan in the Gulf in 1991 now hinges on this one simple question. Will the Iraqi desert west of Kuwait support the weight of more than 50,000 tanks, artillery, and other vehicles, which General Schwarzkopf wants to send around the Iraqi flank? Fortunately, he has the men to find out.
It may seem a little unglamorous, but one of the roles of special forces that were inserted into Iraq was to evaluate the terrain, find out whether it was viable for tracked and wheeled vehicles. And when they had, then of course the flanking attack was on.
Now Schwarzkopf, like Eisenhower and Montgomery in France in 1944, must face the next stage in the battle plan for flank attack. Concealment. Commanders must hide their intentions to prevent the enemy taking countermeasures. In Normandy in July 1944, the concealment plan for the breakout is a continuation of the greatest military deception ever, Operation Bodyguard. The German High Command expects the Allies to choose the shortest route across the English Channel for an invasion and land at the Pas de Calais. The bulk of their armor is positioned there. Bodyguard was the brilliant Allied campaign to convince them they're right, to divert attention away from Normandy and keep those German forces as far from the real invasion beaches in Normandy as possible, for as long as possible. The Allies' greatest weapon in this deception is a phantom army, the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG, supposedly based in Kent, the perfect place to launch an invasion of the Pas-de-Calais. FUSAG includes some genuine reserve units, but is largely made up of smoke and mirrors, and mostly rubber. Double agents fill their reports with intelligence on this false army. False radio traffic based in Kent fills the airwaves. Dummy landing craft, moored with a few real invasion boats, create the illusion of an enormous armada. Inflatable rubber tanks and aircraft suggest a large army ready for a massive invasion. Enemy air reconnaissance is completely fooled. In a final stroke of genius, Allied planners let slip that the commander of this army that doesn't exist is none other than U.S. General George Patton. The sort of bold and dashing leader the German military would expect to lead the biggest invasion of the war. Eisenhower and Montgomery do intend to use him to lead the encirclement once Operation Cobra has begun the breakout. But they know that the moment Patton is spotted in France, the Germans will realize that FUSAG and the Pas-de-Calais were the deception, and Normandy the real thing. So for weeks after D-Day, Patton remains in Kent, and the Germans go on believing that the Pas-de-Calais must be the ultimate Allied goal. The bulk of their armor remains pinned down, far from Normandy.
Part of the Calais deception was that it showed Patton commanding an army in England, issuing messages, ordering troops around, etc. And then he quietly slipped across the channel to take command of the army for the breakout.
In the Gulf in 1990, it's also vital for Schwarzkopf to conduct a concealment operation. His intention is to hit the Iraqi western flank. But this is where some of Saddam's elite Republican Guards divisions are based. Schwarzkopf must not only conceal his plans, but con the Republican Guard into moving deeper into Kuwait. Schwarzkopf will kick off his air campaign in January 1991. But before this, he begins his deception measures to reinforce the Iraqi belief that the main attack will be the frontal assault across the Kuwaiti border from Saudi Arabia. In November 1990, the Marine Expeditionary Force, the MEF, conducts a major amphibious landing rehearsal, Exercise Imminent Thunder. Marine logisticians begin to build a base at Kirbit, just 25 miles south of the Kuwaiti border. Naval forces bombard Iraqi coastal positions and sweep for mines. It's a masterful performance. The Iraqis in Kuwait are completely fooled.
General Schwarzkopf had set up an exceptional deception for the flanking movement. He had the Marine amphibious forces demonstrating in the Gulf. He had Marine assault divisions and Allied divisions on the most likely avenue of approach, and that allowed him to take the heavy forces out and hide them in the desert where the Iraqis couldn't find them.
The night of January 16th, 1991, Schwarzkopf launches his air campaign. The Iraqis are blinded. Then he begins to move U.S. 7th Armored and 18th Airborne Corps west for the flank attack, with the British 1st Armored Division alongside 7th Corps. And then he throws in a whole new layer of deception to conceal this. U.S. Marines begin to build a store and ammunition base at Gravel Plains, adjacent to the Kuwait border, a production clearly visible to Iraqi lookouts. The U.S. 1st Cavalry Armored Division mounts a major dress rehearsal in the Wadi al-Batin area. Naval exercises, bombardments, and mine sweeps are stepped up, while the air campaign means the Iraqis can't see. They can still hear. Like the fake radio messages to convince the Germans there was an army in Kent before D-Day, deception experts do the same in 1991. The airwaves are flooded to persuade Saddam that key units are still in their original start positions along the Kuwaiti border. The U.S. 7th Armored and 18th Airborne Corps leaves small units on the eastern seaboard so Iraqis pick up their radio chatter. The British 1st Armored Division broadcasts radio recordings of divisional field exercises, except they've moved. In the east, trucks are driven to what seems start positions for attack. In the west, the logistics columns move at night and camouflage down at day, their tracks covered. Coalition intelligence reports that the Republican Guard units have taken the bait and are moving from their positions in the west to cover the threat in the east, leaving the flank vulnerable, just as Schwarzkopf hoped. February 24th, 1991. The air campaign has done its job. It's time for Norman Schwarzkopf to press the button. In France in 1944 and the Gulf in 1991, Allied and coalition forces are poised for battle. Both wars hang in the balance. Their commanders now face the next requirement in the battle plan for flank attack: execution. Eisenhower and Montgomery, and Schwarzkopf half a century later, must execute their plans swiftly and mercilessly. In Normandy, Montgomery's forces continue to draw in German reinforcements, clearing the way for the American breakout. In the west, Operation Cobra is scheduled for July 24th, but 3 days of rain bring a delay. Tragically, the recall instruction does not reach all the heavy bombers, and 350 drop their bombs through thick cloud. Some fall short of the German line, hitting U.S. forward troops. Friendly fire kills 111, including Lieutenant General Louis McNair, the highest-ranking American to die during World War II. Morale plummets. The odds seem stacked against the breakout. The bombers return in full force the next day, dropping 5,000 tons of high explosive. But as the U.S. troops move forward, resistance is fierce and progress slow, even with German reinforcements committed to the east. U.S. commanders begin to fear another costly failure. Despite their concern, the carpet bombing has done its job. On July 26th, when the tanks of U.S. 7th Corps are thrown into the battle, German defenses collapse. Meanwhile, the German commander, Gunther von Kluge, is still convinced that Montgomery's assault around Caen represents the main Allied breakout and continues to hold his reserves in the east. Unknowingly, the Allies are benefiting from chaos inside the German High Command. Von Kluge has only just become overall commander-in-chief, while Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the commander in Normandy, is seriously injured by an RAF fighter bomber less than a week before Cobra begins. With German defenses crumbling, the American breakout shifts into high gear. The U.S. tanks clear the bocage and head for open country. Now, Eisenhower unleashes his secret weapon, George Patton, who has secretly slipped into France. On July 27th, he takes command of the leading U.S. ground forces.
Patton was exactly the right personality to command the breakout. He was fixed on speed, on going deep, on rupturing or going around. In fact, even when he was ordered to stop, he continued anyhow. That's the type of personality you need in charge of a breakout.
July 28th, the key town of Coutances falls. 7th and 8th Corps race south. July 30th, Avranches is captured. The German flank is now open.
Although the initial plan for a direct breakout hadn't taken place and a flanking attack had to be used, that flanking attack created great opportunities. It had worked, and now there was a great potential for an encirclement and the destruction of the German army in Normandy.
On August 1st, Patton takes command of a new U.S. Third Army. His mission, to exploit the open flank and go for an encirclement. Patton is the right man in the right place at the right time. Is Schwarzkopf? Over 50 years later, his opening assault in the Gulf must be lethal and merciless, as if Patton himself were leading the attack. The Gulf War, February 1991. Operation Desert Storm, the aerial attack on Iraq, has done its job. Now, Coalition Commander General Norman Schwarzkopf presses the start button for Operation Desert Saber, the ground war. G-Day, Sunday, February 24th, 0400 hours. Along the Kuwaiti border, coalition units, including U.S. Marines, race from their start points for the frontal assault, exactly what Saddam and the world have been led to expect. Then at 0730 hours, far to the west, the French Daguet Division, with a U.S. brigade attached, starts the flank attack. They brush aside the Iraqi 45th Division, then reach and secure their first objective, codename Rochambeau, 25 miles inside Iraq. The Screaming Eagles of the 101st Airborne Division used 300 helicopters to establish an FOB, a forward operating base, 70 miles inside Iraq. Still unseen in the desert, the main attack force waits. On the coalition right, the attack is going well. Maybe too well. Arab and U.S. Marine units penetrate the Iraqi line and push on. It's supposed to be a deception, but they're moving fast.
The Marines are coming up from the south through 2 penetrations, but they're moving faster than anyone thought possible. Everyone thinks it's going perfectly and don't discover the problems until later.
Schwarzkopf's original plan is to begin his main flank attack the next day. But with so little Iraqi resistance, he's now in a hurry. It's time to throw his knockout punch. At midday, he launches the Hail Mary Pass. The 140,000 troops and 1,300 tanks of his unseen 7th Corps. In the center, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red One, breaches the Iraqi defensive wall of sand and brushes aside 2 infantry divisions. The U.S. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment pushes through to screen the advance, and the British 1st Armored Division follows to protect the right flank. Then the main assault force rolls through. By nightfall, the U.S. 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions are more than 30 miles into Iraq. Schwarzkopf's fear that his force is outnumbered has proved groundless.
Within hours of Operation Desert Saber being launched, it became clear to General Schwarzkopf that conventional force ratios did not apply. He had forces which on paper were outnumbered, but in terms of quality were vastly superior. Significantly also, the Iraqis have been subject to an incredible pounding from the air and from the ground before the ground attack went in. They were basically ready to surrender.
The next day, February 25th, the frontal assault of the Marine and Arab coalition forces is within 10 miles of Kuwait City. On the extreme left, the French Daguet Division seizes As Salman airfield, 70 miles deep in Iraq, while the Screaming Eagles fly in to cut the main Baghdad to Basra highway near Nasiriyah. In the center, the U.S. 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions continue to push north, screened by 2nd Armored Cavalry. On their right, the 1st British Armored Division smashes the Iraqi 12th Armored Division. Schwarzkopf's plan seems to be working brilliantly, but it's always been clear there is a possible contradiction between his two main objectives: drive the Iraqis out of Kuwait, but also encircle and destroy them. Now timing is the key, if he is to achieve his ultimate goal of an encirclement. For the frontal assault by U.S. Marines and Arab coalition forces is moving faster than anyone anticipated. It is driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait so quickly, Schwarzkopf's flank attack may not be in place in time to intercept, encircle, and destroy Saddam's army as it retreats.
The initial plan was for the Marines to attack first, and then a day later the Army would attack. Either the plan was not clearly expressed to the Marines, or they were simply too successful at what they did. But the result was, instead of drawing the Iraqi reserves into the pocket in the south, they were driving them out of Kuwait in the north.
February 26th, Day 3 of Operation Desert Saber. On the right, Marine and Arab coalition forces are on the outskirts of Kuwait City. In the center, 7th Corps and the British 1st Armored Division turn east to strike toward northern Kuwait. By early evening, 7th Corps gets what it wants. 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, scouting ahead of 1st and 3rd Armored Divisions, makes first contact with Saddam's much-vaunted Republican Guard. Meanwhile, the British Armored Division brushes aside elements of the Iraqi 17th and 52nd Armored Divisions and destroys 500 enemy armored vehicles. At dusk, U.S. 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions run into their ultimate targets: all three of the Republican Guard's most feared units, the Tawakkana, Medina, and Hammurabi divisions.
What's about to happen is absolutely vital. It's the biggest tank battle since Kursk.
Wednesday, February 27th, and Thursday, February 28th, the 4th and 5th days. U.S. 7th Corps is locked in battle with the Republican Guard. U.S. armor, supported by air power, advances and destroys the Tawakkana and Medina divisions. Then it begins to annihilate the Hammurabi division. Now Iraqi troops start fleeing from Kuwait City toward the Mutla Gap. They are exposed to coalition air forces. The route becomes known as the Highway to Hell. To the world, it seems as though Schwarzkopf is about to close his trap and annihilate Saddam's army once and for all. In both Normandy in 1944 and the Gulf in 1991, the enemy is on the ropes. Now Generals Eisenhower, Montgomery, and Schwarzkopf have reached the final crucial stage in the battle plan for flank attack. Endgame. Commanders must know precisely where their battle plan ends and what they want to have achieved at that point. Normandy, August 1944. British and Canadian forces on the left of the Allied front are still facing stubborn resistance. But U.S. forces on the right have punched a 45-mile corridor down the coast beyond Avranches and around the German left flank. August 3rd, General Bradley instructs Patton to swing his 3rd Army east and thrust deep behind the enemy toward Le Mans. His forces start their blitzkrieg 2 days later. As they move out, Hitler orders all available German armor, regardless of its battle commitments at that moment, to counterattack toward Avranches and isolate Patton's forces. Warned by radio intercepts, the U.S. units facing the German assault stand firm, backed by close air support. The Germans fail to reach the coast. Patton's tanks continue their headlong advance and reach Le Mans on the 8th, creating an 80-mile salient behind the German lines. The British and Canadians finally manage to break out around Caen. This is the moment Allied commanders have been waiting for.
It had been a hard slog for both the British and the American troops, but now Eisenhower and Montgomery had their opportunity. The flanking attack had worked. It was the moment when they could encircle the German army and annihilate it.
Patton's Third Army, plus the French 2nd Armored Division, now race north. Anglo-Canadian forces head south from Caen. Their aim, to trap the Germans in a huge pocket at Falaise. Patton's Third Army is racing to meet up with British and Canadian forces coming the other way, directly toward them. Then Montgomery orders Patton not to advance beyond Argenton, leaving a 15-mile gap between the two prongs of the Allied pincer. Patton vehemently opposes Monty's order. If they don't complete the encirclement, they're leaving an escape route for the German forces around Falaise. But if he tries to close the gap too quickly, Montgomery will run an enormous risk. His two armies will be racing toward each other, weapons loaded, each thinking the other might be the enemy. Military theorists call the maneuver a pass through the lines.
Pass through the lines are difficult, they're dangerous, and if you have not practiced them and you have not coordinated them, they usually go badly. While General Patton may not have been very happy about the failure to close the pocket off, it's hard not to think that General Montgomery wasn't being prudent from the standpoint of minimizing Allied casualties by going and slowly creeping up on Patton's forces.
The Falaise pocket is not immediately sealed off. 40,000 Germans run the gauntlet of Allied artillery and escape. Even so, on August 20th, when Allied forces finally seal off the pocket, thousands of Germans are still trapped inside. The Allies pound them with a massive air and artillery attack. 10,000 German soldiers die. 50,000 are taken prisoner. But Montgomery's caution infuriated Patton and has been controversial ever since.
The failure of the British and American forces to link up and complete their encirclement allows tens of thousands of German soldiers to escape. These soldiers, once they get new equipment, will soon be back in the battle.
But to have moved quicker might have cost more Allied lives.
Of course, Montgomery could have moved quicker, but there's a school of thought which says if he had pushed through to link up with the Americans, it could have been a disaster. It could have been that tragic experience in war of a blue-on-blue contact where friendly forces fire on other friendly forces. The pace of the advance could in fact have saved lives.
The Gulf War, February 1991. Kuwait City has been liberated. Iraqi forces are fleeing. It is endgame for Schwarzkopf. Close the door now, be merciless, and he can annihilate Saddam's army once and for all. But Washington declares an end to the fighting. Whether this was totally a political decision taken by the White House, or whether it was influenced by the military on the ground, is still a matter of debate.
The key objective, liberating Kuwait, was accomplished.
This was the first objective of the Schwarzkopf battle plan. But what about the second, the flanking move, to encircle and destroy?
Unfortunately, the coalition forces didn't close that back door, and as a result, a lot of Iraqi forces escaped to the north.
But here, too, encirclement might have carried a massive cost.
The trapped Iraqi forces might have decided to fight, and that would have resulted in a butcher's bill that would have been much higher than it actually was.
So how did Generals Eisenhower and Montgomery in 1944 and General Schwarzkopf in 1991 meet the requirements in the battle plan for flank attack? Objective. In 1944, Eisenhower and Montgomery had two goals: break out from Normandy, then encircle and destroy Hitler's armor in France. They achieved the first brilliantly, but caution prevented total annihilation of the German forces. Similarly, in 1991, Schwarzkopf had two aims: drive Saddam's forces from Kuwait, then intercept, encircle, and destroy them. Once again, the first was triumphantly achieved, but the second was only partially successful. Force buildup. In 1944, Eisenhower and Montgomery never had a clear numerical supremacy, but they always had total control of the air. In the Gulf in 1991, Schwarzkopf's concern about force ratio turned out to be unjustified. The technological and training superiority of his coalition forces more than made up for any numerical inferiority. Concealment. In Normandy, Montgomery's presence at Caen drew German attention and reinforcements to what they thought was the main assault, and away from the American breakout. And Patton's role was concealed until the very last moment. In the Gulf, Schwarzkopf concealed his Hail Mary flank attack into Iraq by convincing Saddam the main attack would come from the Marines in the east. Execution. In Normandy, Operation Cobra began slowly, but achieved the essential breakthrough. Once Patton took charge, the breakout was lethal. In the Gulf, encirclement couldn't keep up with the speed of the Iraqi collapse. Endgame. In the Normandy breakout and encirclement, military historians still argue whether Montgomery was too cautious or Patton too bold. In the Gulf, too, arguments still rage. Were Schwarzkopf or the politicians in Washington too cautious when they failed to destroy Saddam's power once and for all? So what of the future of flank attack as a battle plan?
The reality is that flank attacks have become a necessary evil. What 50 years ago was optional, today have become required as a means of reducing casualties. You just can't go and flail yourself against fortified, dug-in positions and be expected to go and continue fighting on and on to a victory. So consequently, use of cleverness, of maneuver, and of flanking is one of the keys to modern warfare.
Flank attack has always been one of the most basic battle plans for any commander. And now, more than ever, commanders need to find ways of outwitting their enemy, for public opinion will not allow a nation's troops to be thrown head-on against high-tech weapons and modern defenses. As long as there are armies on the ground, there will be commanders seeking to outflank them.